Hi, I'm your host, Dan Cluche, and this is Renewables. And uh, we often get a chuckle out of Dilbert. This particular energy one was really good, I thought. So he says, kudos to Ted for his suggestion to put motion sensors on the lights in the break room. Great thing. Love energy efficiency. Long been saying there is no alternative to efficiency. And Dilbert puts up his hand and says, hold it, I calculate that the energy savings are offset by the lost productivity of this meeting. And so the pointy haired one ends up saying, we have to burn your plaque for heat just to break even. And that's kind of well encapsulates a lot of the challenges that we have in front of us, whether we like it or not, or want to acknowledge it or not, or what have you. And this presentation will come at it, I think, in some ways that are a little different than perhaps what you've seen. So, of course, what you'll see out there in the world from time to time is things like this little box here represents the annual world consumption of energy. And then it says, what ends up being the case is that um, the annual solar energy, of course, is way bigger than that box. And so, yay, we have it all solved and it's easy and all that good stuff. But then, of course, and I'm not going to go into all the details by any means, but we end up looking at, well, what's really the solar budget? Because people include things that, well, how about if we can capture incoming solar energy before it's reflected by the atmosphere or by the clouds, and so on and so forth. And great stuff. Hope it all works. Don't know what year to count on it on. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time running through all those numbers. If you look at the world with that perspective and those R&D efforts, there certainly is abundance. But we got some work to do to get there. And of course, all of life, including human life, does run principally on contemporary sunlight that enters the top of our atmosphere at approximately 1.4 kilowatts per square meter. And that sounds great, but then only roughly half of that reaches the Earth's surface. And then, depending where you are, there's 8,760 hours in a year. And typically, we have about 2,000 hours of solar energy, including for nighttime and so forth. And so, these are all the facts of the matter, and why our ancestors were not misled. They were really very masterful at working with solar, with windmills, mind you, not turbines as we have now, and they were masters at using the energy from water when they had it, and so on and so forth. And it's great stuff. But kind of going back to all renewable, what we end up looking at is things like with wind turbines that to produce 1 cubic mile of oil slash electricity equivalent from wind will require 3 million 2 megawatt wind turbines. And those turbines will occupy 580,000 acres of combined space. And we've already seen that, we can put these windmills and solar panels out in the desert, nobody will care. And there's some endangered tortoises, desert tortoises, that care greatly. And we find the wind turbines impact bats in a great big way, and many of those are endangered, and big birds of prey and so forth. And so everything's connected, big surprise. And we have on Earth a limited amount of land and even out at sea. But more importantly, once we get into this, we'll end up seeing that we have a lot of energy we need to generate, as I'll touch on with this slide. And one of the things that's different is we'll show you the connectiveness of materials and so forth. So anyway, on a percentage basis, back in 2010, renewables took the gold for growth without a doubt at the impressive rate at that year of 13% growth. And it had been multiple years of that. And from an absolute perspective, the news is more sobering, says ARC Financial in this report, because systems like wind, solar, biomass are not taking market share away fast enough to make a difference to disconcerting matrices like carbon intensity. And that was because and is still as of 2022, because coal and natural gas are also growing at a good clip on massively higher volumes, as we've showed in the previous 6 parts. And the share of renewables in the world's energy diet in 2013 was 1.4%, and increasing by about 0.1% per year. And that means unless something changes under current conditions, it would be require about 200 to 1,000 years to put the fossil fuel industry to bed. And we've had absolutely increased that pace. So are we 100 years or 500 years off? I don't know exactly those numbers at the moment, but that's the challenge that we face, and that's what these various pundits, when they looked at it, and they said, for renewable energy to take what percentage of electricity production. For ExxonMobil, as we see here, they said, well, by 2040, they believe that renewable can cover 16% of electricity production. I'm going to say they didn't comment on heat or transport. I'm not sure that that's quite accurate, but BP was more optimistic, as you can say or see, and they said, well, by 2030, they believe that renewable could take 25% of electricity and 7% of transport. And that's big number, particularly by 2030. And they were saying that as of 2012. And 10 years later, we're not halfway there, right? So that's just the reality of these sorts of predictions. Greenpeace was completely off the charts, irrationally optimistic, as they often are. And they said, these things, and I'll just leave it there. Back in 2012, each of these looked at it and said, well, what could we do by 2050? And the International Energy Agency said, well, maybe we can be, by 2050, 57% of electricity renewable. Didn't comment on heat, which is the largest user, by the way, again, and transport, 39%. And then we had off the chart estimates by Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. So that's in the case of Exxon, BP, the International Energy Agency, those are kind of the best of the best statisticians on energy and access to the best of the best expertise, as far as I'm aware. So they're dealing with those realities. At the same time, a collection of these same folks were looking at saying, well, if I was born in 2010, I can anticipate that I would have oil available until 2045. Lots of people say, no, that's not true at all. That's crazy. Um, you know, it's longer. Let's not debate that necessarily. That's just what is said in this graph. They tend to be believers that coal use goes way out. I would refute those numbers, but we won't go into that debate either. They said, oh, what about for natural gas? And they acknowledge that uranium isn't necessarily that far out, although 2080 is pretty cool. But that's years remaining if production remains static, and that's a big question mark, of course. Then you look at, well, how much metals are used in renewable energy solutions, and that's interesting to me, as well as other industrial metals. So we're going to dive into that in a little more detail. But what we do see is that natural gas and nuclear use the least materials when it comes to putting energy production in place. Geothermal's fairly small footprint, but of course, solar PV, hydro, and wind are on the high end of the equation. So that's the reality. Now, what this chart is showing here is this is from iron ore to rare earths. Here are all the metals we mined in 2019. And it's just giving you a spatial perspective and a huge amount of tonnage, which of course all uses a lot of energy to do these things. And then when you look and you say, well, when it comes to the power grid, how much is being used, and wind and solar, and what you end up finding is that they're estimating that copper demand from wind power installations could more than double by 2030. That's a big deal, and you'll see more on that in a moment. They're saying that demand for copper for EV charging is expected to rise by more than 1,000% by 2030 compared to 2020, and this is from Bloomberg. So big estimates. These people's perspective on the flip side is that copper intensity of renewables kind of looks like so for solar PV and wind farm and offshore wind farms and so forth. I'm not going to go through all the stats. All I think is you can see, the projections, and they're off the charts. And then we get this really important perspective is this demand represents just 3 technologies, and the overall copper market is expected to be in a 500,000 ton deficit. And they were saying in 2021, which was current as of that time, that's what had been taking place. Now, clearly, we haven't run out of copper, but we've certainly seen copper prices rise very dramatically, and we know it's under pressure. And you can see supply chain shortages today, caused by all kinds of supply chain disruption, not necessarily the base metal, but you start to get a perspective of these things. And then you also have to just look at some of these pictures, and we go, pipelines terribly bad. It's because of the oil. It's not lost on me, but that lithium mine that's supposedly all beautiful and good. I could go on at length in these comparisons, and I'm not going to say one is perfect and the other's bad, vice versa. I'm just saying we got a lot of realities to deal with, and the lipstick on the pig here is not appropriate, and calling this an ugly pig is not appropriate. It's not the reality. So this chart's I find very valuable and interesting. And if you really want to look at the in-depth of reality through the eyes of a physicist that is doing all kinds of calculations, this professor of is just really good. And the website is Do the Math, and you can see it there. So basically what he tried to do here is put together a matrix looking at the various alternative energy sources that we have, and trying to give a score. So we'll just zip through, and if you want to read this, I encourage you to go to Do the Math, and you'll be able to see all of the rationale and a great deal of breakdown that goes behind this, which is great. So anyway, he'll say first thing, as we just covered, so solar PV, you got abundance. Not difficult to do. Intermittency, we always hear about it. Well, is it demonstrated? You bet. Does it produce electricity? Yes. Heat doesn't get a green box or a +1 score, because heat's via electrical, transports via electrical. Not great. Acceptance is reasonably good. Yeah, it's in this criteria. It says, can you do it in your own backyard? Yeah, to some degree, absolutely. And the efficiency is not great. Solar is 25%. Solar PV is 25% efficient, state of the art today. So you can see, well, solar PV works, solar thermal works. He gives a high score to what he calls solar heating. I would call that concentrated solar. I think he's a bit wrong here, because the storage, if I have high temperature heat, is really good. I can produce electricity on a very large scale, is proven. Same problems as wind, because, if I'm doing it out in the desert, I would want to claim that there's nothing there that cares. Not quite right. And no, it doesn't deal with transportation any more than truthfully solar PV does. He points out that hydroelectric is not abundant. Depending where you are, you might argue that. He does point out that there's a bit of a seasonal flow. Depending where you are, you might argue that. And, hydroelectric via electric, same thing with, or for heat and transport, yes. He shows an opportunity maybe in some locations for micro hydro, but for the most part, it can't do it in most backyards or few backyards. Absolutely. So then he looks at biofuel algae, which we talked about very briefly. We're very excited about that. He acknowledges that you absolutely have abundance. He says there's difficulty there. I'm not going to disagree with that. He says no intermittency, absolutely. Demonstrated some R&D, yeah, not ruling that out. He thinks that if you're generating electricity with algae biofuel, it's a misspent resource. With the abundance that we have, I'm not convinced, and I think that you can really be doing that with diesel generation and particularly cogeneration, as we talked about. And yes, we can do that at a small scale, and our efficiency is over 90% when we're doing that with cogen. So he only gave it a 4. I would give it a 5, absolutely. Geothermal, as he says, is it abundant? Iceland, that's one example of it's fantastically abundant. It's kind of like hydroelectric, depends where you are. And difficulty isn't bad. Intermittency is not so much of a problem, depending where you are, although you can really see some economics, cash implications in cold climates, particularly with heat pumps and electrical pumps and so forth. So he gives it a 4. It typically has like a 15-year payback. I don't know that I would agree with a 4, but it's not so far off. Wind, we've covered that. They say that the best wind locations in the world, the turbines operate about 35% of the time, is my understanding. So yes, there's abundance, but that intermittency is a big deal. And so I'll agree with his 3. Artificial photosynthesis, he calls it active development. I think from what I hear, it's much more of an R&D project. And so I don't know that you can give something that is theoretical a 3. I would be saying, well, once it comes out of the lab, truthfully, then sure. And so I'll include a number of these in that same sort of talking point: artificial photosynthesis, tidal, various breeders and reactors. I'll throw ocean thermal and current and ocean waves and cold fusion and so forth in all of that same mix. And then I'll agree with him wholeheartedly on biocrops, saying, it's a 1. It's just not efficient enough. It's not to say there's not some role for it, but not necessarily great. So really rather quickly, that's the best chart I've ever seen to really kind of give that executive summary and say, well, let's look at what there is when it comes to renewables. And so what we end up with is, well, how have we had the growth since 2010 that we have in renewables? And we know that an awful lot of that has come from subsidies, from not free markets being entirely left to their own, but injecting tax dollars and government subsidies into the mix, and solar's certainly had the most, and wind second. I'm not sure that, I guess in recent years, I'll believe that maybe nuclear has received that little a subsidy, but in previous decades and so forth, that certainly hasn't been the case. And even hydropower sometimes has seen an awful lot of subsidy. And California has provided more subsidy from a North American standpoint than anywhere. And we can see, well, look, it's seen their energy, or at least their electricity rates, really rise very rapidly. And Germany was the European leader, and they're not different. And even for all that expenditure, they still remain, as we've seen in recent months, just hugely dependent on natural gas in particular. So despite all that, they really haven't been able to move the ball nearly as much as they'd like to on renewables. So what's the effect of some of these things? Well, the fact is, as we've shown you, looking at energy as we have in these series, and in energy having that role of master currency, what we end up looking at is that as the volume of energy gets affected, and in the early days with fossil fuels, and the amount of reinvestment of energy to keep this feedback loop going being minimal, we really had a great thing in that, essentials, food, and so forth, weren't that big a percent of our expenditures. And therefore, we had a nice lifestyle in the G20 countries, and we had a fairly substantial amount of discretionary spending. As our return on energy invested decreases, what we end up with is, of course, more and more our budget is going towards this type of loop. And truthfully, that includes renewables, because how it increased costs and so forth. And therefore, of course, we can't get away from the amount we need to spend on essentials, food and shelter, and so forth. And what gets shrunk is this discretionary spending. So these are very current stats from February of 2022, and what it showed is, fuel oil rocketed up, and gasoline, of course, has to be pretty much right behind it, and airfares right behind that, and the gasoline and diesel and so forth, of course, ends up driving up meat costs and grocery costs, and natural gas drive up electricity, and these fuel costs drive up the base metals that we need for cars and trucks and all of that kind of stuff. And so master currency underlying an inflationary force when those numbers go up, and all of that impacts lifestyle, and it's very difficult to avoid. And renewables is going to help keep a lid on that. But this notion that it will be easy transition, no. Immediate transition, no. Get us back to this picture in the near term, it looks pretty doubtful, particularly when we consider the matrix from Do the Math that I just took you through. So as we wrap up, and having looked at what we have, we end up recognizing that cheap fossil fuels arrived, and they really enabled the industrial revolution. Not very many people argue against that. They recognize it was coal and oil that did that, and in fact, provided mightily for the green revolution, whether it's Henry Ford's first small tractors, but more importantly, natural gas, derived nitrogen fertilizer, and then mining for phosphorus and the other two big fertilizers. And so we ended up, thanks to green revolution enabling relatively inexpensive food, we overall saw a population explosion and exponential GDP growth and consumption explosion, or consumer explosion. And now perhaps we're at that time where on the bell curve, we've used, say, more than 50% or what have you of our coal, and our oil, and our natural gas, and maybe our uranium. And what we are seeing is a struggle to maintain that energy era lifestyle that particularly the G20 nations enjoyed. And to some degree, as we've tried to maintain it, we've seen a debt explosion. And now we're seeing a certain amount of GDP growth waning. And we unequivocally know that growth is essential to service debt. So not to end up on a depressing note, but where are we going next? Well, you could look at it and say this is the current trajectory that we're on. And then you could say, or hopefully not have to say, that energy scarcity inflation is more in the mix, and fertilizer inflation is very real, and we're having more and more water and soil issues, and therefore more food inflation, and so even essentials are just becoming more and more difficult. But that is that. And there is options for this, and that's the intelligent responses that we've begun to lay out, and we'll continue to lay out as we further this series. And there's lots to talk about, whether it's gaining acreage because we're locating on rooftops, or we're gaining acreage through a certain amount of vertical farming. And yes, we're really going to have to think through energy as we do that, because artificial lights are not the most energy friendly thing by any means. And so, will more vertical farming end up in greenhouses, and why? And some of the things that we've shown very briefly, but we can show further, is the work that we're doing in being able to provide virtually free of electricity cooling, not only for greenhouses but other buildings. And so we'll show how that works. And we'll talk about how readily available and doable passive solar heating, not just for greenhouses, but other buildings is. And we will look at the things that we can do with compost heating and other things, as far as being able to use types of digesters to capture nutrients, so they're constantly providing soil amendment, but also contributing with biogas. We have talked a little bit about aquaponics and how that can be huge in reducing our artificial fertilizer costs and usage, while providing very needed protein and some really old technologies and some new things in that mix, and very much part of the solution. We'll spend more time talking about concentrated solar and where that can go. We've touched on cogeneration and quad generation, and we'll expand on that as we're going forward. We'll expand on algae greenhouses, because we find the whole subject area really, really inspiring, exciting, and an intelligent response. And all of that is really only a fragment of what regenerative agriculture or permaculture has to offer. And so the journey of 1,000 miles always begins with the first steps. Inch by inch, it's a cinch. Yard by yard, it's hard. In some ways, what we've been doing with renewables is kind of the yard by yard approach. But what we intend to continue to show with these podcasts and vlogs is just the intelligent responses that are in front of us. And no, there's not likely to be a silver bullet in these things. Mostly it's layering new ways, meeting some old ways of doing things, so that we can maintain wonderful lifestyles. I'll sign off here and look forward to next time.